The Keth Mori ships moved through the darkness of space like pieces of shattered crystal, each one catching and reflecting distant starlight. These weren't just any ships. They were the last hope for 50,000 people who had nowhere else to go. Once upon a time, the Keth Mori had been proud owners of 3 entire star systems. They had cities that floated in the clouds, mines that dug deep into asteroid belts, and trade routes that stretched across the galaxy. Now all of that was gone. Their ships were beautiful, even broken as they were, made from some kind of living crystal that grew and shaped itself. These vessels had once been the envy of other species. But now, tiny cracks spread across their hulls like spider webs. Air leaked out slowly but surely. The life support systems groaned and wheezed, working harder than they were ever meant to. Every day that passed meant more systems failing, more people getting sick, more hopes slipping away. Commander Veltar stood on the bridge of what used to be called the Crown Jewel, though nobody called it that anymore. Through the transparent crystal walls, he could see another star system getting smaller and smaller behind them. Another door slammed shut. Another chance gone forever. His aide, a young Keth Mori named Nixtal, approached quietly. The poor kid had been barely grown when their homeworld died. He'd never known the glory days, only this endless journey from rejection to rejection. 17th rejection, sir, he whispered, as if saying it too loud might make it hurt worse. 17 different species. 17 different ways of being told to get lost. The Veilth Empire had been polite about it. At least, they'd sent official documents explaining that refugee populations were economically disruptive to established trade networks. Translation: you're too poor and desperate, and that makes us uncomfortable. The Zephyrians have been even more creative with their excuses. Cultural incompatibility, they called it. The Keth Mori were too different, too strange. Their crystal technology didn't fit with Zephyrian bioengineering. Their musical language clashed with Zephyrian telepathy. They were just too alien for a species that prided itself on accepting diversity, unless that diversity came with empty hands and desperate eyes. But the Croneks had been the most honest, in their brutal way. They didn't bother with fancy words or diplomatic doublespeak. Their warships had simply powered up weapons and formed a wall between the Keth Mori fleet and their space. The message was clear: keep moving or become space dust. At least Veltar could respect that kind of straightforward cruelty. Advanced civilizations, he thought with growing bitterness. They had advanced technology, advanced weapons, advanced economies, but they also had advanced ways of turning their backs on suffering. The more sophisticated they became, the better they got at building walls and finding excuses. The bridge fell silent, except for the constant background hum of failing systems. Somewhere in the lower levels, Veltar knew families were gathered around their few remaining possessions, trying to keep their children calm and hopeful. The medical bays were fuller every day with people whose bodies couldn't handle the stress of their dying ships. The food processors were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. A voice broke the silence. "Sir," called out Operative Gentar from the navigation station. She was one of their best, had served on deep space exploration missions back when the Keth Mori still had deep space to explore. Long-range sensors are picking up something interesting. Veltar moved closer to her station, hope and dread fighting in his chest. What kind of something? It's a small system, nothing special about the star. Yellow dwarf, pretty common type. But the third planet from the star, it's showing all kind of life signs. Oxygen atmosphere, liquid water, complex ecosystem. That sounded promising, but Veltar had learned not to get excited too quickly. And the inhabitants? Gentar's face scrunched up as she studied her readings more closely. That's the weird part, sir. They're definitely intelligent. We're picking up radio signals, satellite networks, some kind of global communication system. But they're primitives. I mean really primitive. They've barely left their own planet. A few tiny bases on their moon, some automated probes scattered around their system. But that's it. No faster-than-light travel, no energy shields, no plasma weapons. The bridge crew exchanged glances. Primitives meant a species that wasn't part of the Galactic Council. It meant people who might not have learned yet that refugees were problems to be avoided. It might mean their first real chance in months. Veltar stared at the readings on Gentar's screen, a small blue and green world, spinning peacefully around its unremarkable star. No mighty fleets guarded its borders. No advanced civilizations had claimed it as their territory. Just primitives who didn't know any better. Set course to the third planet, he ordered quietly, and sent a message to the other ships. Tell them we might have found something. As the Kethmori fleet changed direction toward this unknown world, Veltar allowed himself the smallest spark of hope. Maybe being primitive wasn't such a bad thing after all. Earth had seen a lot of crazy things throughout history, but nothing quite prepared humanity for the morning when massive crystal ships appeared in the sky above every major city. These weren't the sleek metal spacecraft from science fiction movies. They looked like someone had taken the most beautiful cathedral windows ever made and shaped them into vessels that caught and scattered sunlight in ways that hurt to look at directly. The first reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Panic spread faster than wildfire. Stock markets crashed within minutes. Emergency broadcast systems screamed warnings across every television and radio station. Military bases went on high alert, scrambling fighter jets that looked like toys next to the massive alien vessels. People fled cities in traffic jams that stretched for hundreds of miles. Social media exploded with blurry photos and wild theories. But here's where things got weird. Instead of death rays or invasion forces, the ships just hovered there, waiting. And then, cutting through all the chaos and fear, came something nobody expected: music. The alien ships were singing. It wasn't like human music. The sounds were too complex, too layered, like listening to a crystal glass orchestra playing underwater. But there was something unmistakably desperate about it. Anyone who heard it felt the same thing deep in their gut. These weren't conquerors. These were people asking for help. Radio operators around the world started working frantically to establish contact. Ham radio enthusiasts, NASA communication specialists, even teenagers with modified CB radios. Everyone was trying to talk to the visitors. The breakthrough came when a linguistics professor at Cambridge figured out that the aliens were using mathematical sequences embedded in their musical language. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had been having her morning coffee when the ships appeared. She was supposed to be heading to a conference about interstellar communication theory, which suddenly became the most relevant job on Earth. By noon, she found herself leading the first official contact team, walking up a ramp made of what looked like solidified light onto an alien spacecraft. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd spent her entire career studying the possibility of first contact, but actually living it was something else entirely. The inside of the ship was even more beautiful than the outside, with walls that seemed to grow and flow like living crystal. But there was something wrong with the picture. The crystal looked dull and cracked. Lights flickered where they should have been steady. The musical humming that filled the ship sounded strained and tired. The universal translator device that the team had hastily put together was barely working. It caught maybe every third word of the alien language, turning their musical speech into choppy, broken English. But when Commander Veltar led her through the ship, language barriers didn't matter. The medical bays told the story better than any words could. Alien children, and they were obviously children, despite their crystalline features, lay in beds that looked more like flower petals. Some were barely breathing. Others stared with eyes that had seen too much suffering. The medical equipment around them sparked and wheezed, clearly failing. Dying. Veltar managed in broken English. His voice harmonized with itself in ways that made Rebecca's translator squeal with feedback. Ship's broken. No. Home. Rebecca didn't need a translation for what she was seeing. These people were refugees, and their lifeboats were falling apart. When Veltar showed her the food storage areas, mostly empty, and the life support systems that were clearly running on borrowed time, she made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her communication device without asking permission from anyone back on Earth. This is Dr. Walsh to Mission Control. We need emergency relief ships up here right now. Medical supplies, oxygen generators, food, everything we can spare. The response came back immediately. Dr. Walsh, you don't have the authority to authorize relief operations. We need to establish protocols, run security checks, get approval from the UN Security Council. Rebecca looked around at the dying alien children, at the desperate hope in Veltar's crystalline features, at the failing systems that were all that stood between 50,000 people and the cold vacuum of space. "Tom," she interrupted, "people are dying up here. Children are dying. We can figure out the paperwork later. Send the ships. Send them now." What happened next amazed even Rebecca. Within 6 hours, human spacecraft were docking with the alien vessels. But these weren't military ships or official government transports. They were cargo haulers normally used to supply the International Space Station, medical transport ships that usually ferried supplies to remote research stations, even civilian spacecraft that had been hastily converted to carry emergency supplies. The Keth Mori watched in stunned disbelief as humans they'd never met risked their lives to bring them food, medicine, and spare parts. No contract were signed. No payment was demanded. No territorial agreements were negotiated. Humans simply saw suffering and responded the only way they knew how, by helping. Ship captains who had been hauling grain to Mars colonies suddenly found themselves delivering medical oxygen to dying aliens. Families donated their emergency food supplies. Engineers worked around the clock to figure out how to interface human life support systems with alien crystal technology. It was messy, chaotic, and completely improvised. But it worked. For the first time in months, Keth Mori children stopped dying. Their ship's life support system stabilized. Hope began to replace despair. The galaxy's outcasts had finally found something they'd given up believing existed. People who cared more about helping than about protecting themselves. What happened next broke every rule the galaxy thought it knew about how civilizations were supposed to behave. Instead of keeping the aliens in quarantine zones or detention facilities like every other species would have done, something incredible started happening across Earth. Regular people, not governments or military officials, but ordinary families, began volunteering to take Keth Mori refugees into their homes. The Johnson family in Ohio cleared out their garage and converted it into a living space for a Keth Mori couple and their young child. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't eat the same food, and they definitely didn't look anything alike. But somehow it worked. The Keth Mori child, barely taller than a human toddler but with skin that sparkled like crushed diamonds, would sit at the kitchen table every morning eating human cereal while the Johnson kids got ready for school. In apartments across Tokyo, families squeezed together to make room for crystal beings who hummed lullabies that sounded like wind chimes. In small towns across America's heartland, church communities pooled their resources to house entire Keth Mori family groups. Farmers in rural Australia set up camps on their land, working alongside aliens to figure out what kind of earth crops might work with Keth Mori digestive systems. The children made it all seem natural. Human kids have this amazing ability to accept weird stuff as completely normal, and having crystal people living next door was apparently just another cool thing that happened sometimes. 8-year-old Katie Chun from San Francisco became internet famous when her crayon drawing of herself holding hands with her Keth Mori space sister went viral. The picture showed 2 stick figures, one regular, one covered in sparkly crystal patterns, standing under a rainbow with "Friends Forever" written in shaky letters across the top. But it wasn't just kids being cute. Something deeper was happening. Musicians started collaborating in ways nobody thought possible. The Keth Mori communicated partially through music. Their voices able to create harmonies that human ears could hear, but human throats couldn't reproduce. So human musicians started creating backing tracks that complemented alien melodies, resulting in songs that made people cry without understanding why. A jazz musician named Charlie Davis from New Orleans spent weeks working with Keth Mori composer named Siltar. They didn't share a language, but they shared rhythm. Charlie would play his saxophone while Siltar sang in those impossible harmonies. And together, they created something that sounded like what hope might sound like if hope could make noise. Artists collaborated too. Human painters learned to mix pigments with crushed Keth Mori crystal dust, creating colors that shifted and changed depending on the angle you viewed them from. Keth Mori craftspeople taught human children how to grow crystal sculptures using their own bioelectric fields. The results were beautiful and completely impossible according to human science, but nobody seemed to care about impossibility anymore. Captain James Murphy had been running cargo ships between Earth and Mars for 15 years before the aliens arrived. He thought he'd seen everything space had to offer. But now he found himself working 18-hour days coordinating relief efforts from a command center in Houston, and half his staff were crystal people who hummed while they worked. Murphy was the kind of guy who fixed problems with his hands, not his brain. He didn't do philosophy or deep thinking. But working alongside the Kethmori was changing something in how he saw the universe. These weren't just refugees. They were engineers, artists, parents, teachers. They had been a civilization that built wonders humans couldn't imagine. And now, they were grateful beyond words for a cot in someone's garage and 3 meals a day. One evening, after a particularly long day of organizing supply runs to the orbital refugee camps, Murphy found himself sitting in the break room with Commander Veltar. They'd been working together for weeks now, using a combination of broken English, hand gestures, and translation apps to communicate. Veltar's crystal features always seemed to glow a little brighter when he was thinking hard about something. "Your people," Veltar said carefully, his voice creating those weird harmonies that Murphy was getting used to. "Why do you help strangers? We offer you nothing. We bring only problems. Your government gains no advantage from our presence." Murphy took a swig of his coffee and thought about it. This was exactly the kind of question he usually avoided. Too complicated, too much thinking required. But looking at Veltar, this being who had lost everything and was still grateful for human kindness, Murphy felt like he owed him an honest answer. "Hell, I don't know the fancy philosophical answer," Murphy said finally. "Someone's hurt. You help them. That's just what you do. I mean, what else would we do? Let you die out there? That's not how we're built." The translation app struggled with Murphy's casual language, but Veltar seemed to understand anyway. His crystal features shifted in what Murphy had learned was a Kethmori equivalent of confusion or surprise. The concept seemed to break something fundamental in Veltar's understanding of how the universe worked. For thousands of years, his people had dealt with a galaxy where every interaction was a transaction. Aid came with price tags. Help came with contracts and conditions and interest rates. Species helped other species because they expected something in return: resources, territory, technology, political alliances. But humanity simply helped, not because they expected payment or rewards or strategic advantages. They helped because people needed help, and that was reason enough. It was revolutionary. It was impossible. It was completely human. Of course, not everyone on Earth was happy about having alien house guests. The world is a fairy tale, and fear spreads just as fast as kindness sometimes. Within weeks of the Kethmori arrival, protests started popping up in major cities around the world. People held signs saying, "Earth for Earthlings," and "Send them back to space." News channels ran endless debates about whether humanity was being too trusting, too generous, too stupid. In London, thousands of protesters marched through the streets demanding that the government explain why taxpayer money was being spent on alien refugees when there were still homeless people sleeping under bridges. In New York, angry crowds gathered outside the UN building, shouting about job security and cultural preservation. Some protesters worried about alien diseases. Others feared that the crystal technology would put human workers out of jobs. A few extremist groups even claimed the whole thing was an elaborate invasion plan. The politicians, of course, smelled opportunity in the chaos. Senator Richard Blake from Texas held press conferences every other day, demanding that the Kethmori pay their way. "These aliens have technology that's centuries ahead of ours." He'd rant at anyone with a camera. "If they want our protection, they better start sharing. Fair trade, people. Nothing in life is free." Governor Patricia Williams from California took a different approach, but reached the same conclusion. "We're spending billions on refugee support," she announced during a heated television interview. Meanwhile, these beings could solve our energy crisis, revolutionize our medicine, transform our space program. It's time they started contributing to the society that's protecting them. The pressure wasn't just coming from humans, either. The Kethmori themselves were splitting into factions over how to handle their situation. A group led by someone called Elder Morthak started calling themselves the Purists. They believed their people were becoming too dependent on human charity, losing their dignity and their identity in the process. "We were once builders of worlds, Morthak would say during heated community meetings held in converted warehouses across Earth. Now we beg for scraps and sleep in alien homes like pets. We shame our ancestors with this weakness. The purists wanted to leave Earth, to find some uninhabited planet where they could rebuild their civilization without owing anyone anything. They saw human kindness as a trap, a way of keeping the Kethmori weak and grateful. Some even suggested that humanity was no different from the other galactic species, just more subtle in their exploitation. These internal tensions were creating cracks in the refugee communities. Families argued about whether their children should learn human languages or focus on preserving Kethmori traditions. Some refugees stopped accepting human assistance, trying to make it on their own even when they clearly needed help. The unity that had gotten them through their darkest moments was starting to fracture. Then, 6 months after the Kethmori arrived, everything changed. Long-range sensors detected ships approaching Earth's solar system. Big ships, military ships, ships that belonged to the Galactic Council. The lead vessel was a massive dreadnought flying the colors of the Veilth Empire. It positioned itself just outside Earth's moon, accompanied by a small fleet of support ships. The message that came through on all frequencies was delivered in perfect, condescending English. This is Admiral Zextar of the Veilth Imperial Fleet. Speaking for the Galactic Council, the transmission began. The voice was smooth, educated, and completely arrogant. Primitive species of the third planet, you are currently harboring known refugees and displaced persons in direct violation of Council Directive 2847. These individuals were rejected by 17 member civilizations for valid security and economic reasons. You will immediately surrender them for a proper relocation to designated containment facilities. The Admiral went on to explain, in the tone you'd use to lecture a particularly slow child, that Earth was too primitive to understand the complexities of galactic politics. The Kethmori weren't just refugees. They were destabilizing elements who had already caused economic disruption across multiple systems. Keeping them on Earth would only lead to problems that humanity couldn't possibly handle. The entire world held its breath waiting for the response. This was it. The moment when Earth would have to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. President Lisa Martinez called an emergency session of the UN Security Council, but she didn't wait for their decision. Standing in the White House press room, with cameras broadcasting her words across the galaxy, she delivered a response that would be remembered for generations. Admiral Zextar, she began, looking directly into the camera as if she could see through space to the alien warship. With all due respect, these people asked us for sanctuary, and we said yes. That's not a decision we're prepared to reverse. If you're looking for someone to push around, I suggest you find another planet to bully. The galaxy had never heard anything like it. A primitive species talking back to the Council. A backwater world telling the most powerful military forces in known space to take a hike. The Council's response was predictable. Economic sanctions, trade embargoes, threats to destroy any Earth ships that left the solar system. They expected humanity to fold immediately, to hand over to refugees in exchange for being left alone. Instead, humanity did something that shocked everyone, including themselves. Working with Kethmori engineers, they began freely sharing crystal-growing technology with every nation on Earth. Not selling it, sharing it, giving it away. Within months, countries that had been struggling with energy shortages were growing crystal-powered collectors that could store solar energy for weeks. Nations that couldn't afford space programs were launching crystal ships that could reach Mars in days instead of months. The technology wasn't being hoarded by the wealthy or controlled by corporations. It was being handed out like seeds, allowed to grow wherever it was needed most. The message to the galaxy was unmistakable. Earth didn't need the Galactic Council. The Council, with its stagnant technology and its political games, was starting to need Earth. The bullies had just discovered that their victim could hit back, and humanity was just getting started. 5 years had passed since the first crystalline ships appeared in Earth's skies, and the planet was almost unrecognizable. Walking through any major city now felt like stepping into a science fiction movie that somebody had decided to make real. Crystal spires twisted up alongside traditional steel skyscrapers. their surfaces catching sunlight and converting it into clean energy that powered entire neighborhoods. The buildings seemed to breathe with life of their own, growing slightly taller each year as their crystal foundations absorbed minerals from soil. New York's skyline sparkled like a jewelry box. London's Thames reflected not just bridges and boats, but floating crystal gardens that purified the water as they drifted downstream. In Mumbai, massive crystal farms stretched across former slums, growing food in vertical towers that fed millions of people who had never known where their next meal was coming from. The agricultural revolution had been the biggest game changer. Kethmori farming techniques didn't just grow food faster, they grew it smarter. Plants that could thrive in desert sand, crops that actually improved soil quality while they grew, fruits and vegetables that contained exactly the nutrients each person needed based on their individual biology. World hunger wasn't completely eliminated, but it was no longer an impossible problem. It was just a logistics challenge that humanity was getting better at solving every day. The first joint human Kethmori colonies on Mars had exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. New Harmony, built into the red planet's largest canyon, housed over 100,000 residents of both species. The crystal domes that covered the settlement weren't just protective barriers. They were living ecosystems that converted Martian carbon dioxide into breathable air while growing food and generating power. Human engineering and Kethmori biotechnology had created something neither species could have built alone. But the real miracle wasn't happening on planets at all. It was happening in the space between them. Earth's orbital stations had multiplied like soap bubbles, each one a small city floating in the void. New Geneva Station was the largest, a sprawling complex of interconnected modules and crystal growths that housed over 50,000 beings. It served as both a refugee processing center and a permanent home for those who chose to stay. Ships arrived at the stations almost every week now, but they weren't the sleek vessels of the Galactic Council. These were desperate, patched-together refugee craft carrying species that the galaxy had written off as worthless. The Zektari, whose homeworld had been strip-mined until it was uninhabitable. The Mordan, who had been enslaved for so long they'd forgotten they were supposed to be free. The Kilnari, whose crime was being too peaceful to defend themselves when aggressive neighbors decided they wanted Kilnari territory. Word had spread to the underground networks that connected the galaxy's forgotten peoples. Smugglers carried a message along with their illegal cargo. Refugee camps whispered about it around dying fires. Pirates mentioned it between raids. There was a world where they didn't ask what you could offer in trade. They only asked what you needed to survive. Commander Veltar stood on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, watching the latest arrival dock at Bay 47. His reflection in the viewport showed how much he'd changed over the past 5 years. The stress lines around his crystalline features had faded. His skin had regained the bright luminescence that marked a healthy Kethmori. Most importantly, he wore the dual citizenship badge that marked him as both Kethmori and human, something that would have been impossible to imagine in the old galaxy. Beside him, Admiral Rebecca Walsh watched the same scene with obvious satisfaction. She'd come a long way from that terrified linguistics professor who'd stepped aboard an alien ship with shaking hands. The promotion to Admiral had been well-deserved. She'd basically invented the field of interspecies diplomacy from scratch, and her techniques were being copied by refugee communities across known space. The ship docking below them carried the Velthari, a species nobody had heard from in decades. Their homeworld had been consumed by a stellar explosion, and the survivors had been wandering space in generation ships that were falling apart from age and neglect. This particular ship looked like it was held together with hope and salvage parts, but it had made it to Earth's solar system. That was all that mattered. Think the Council ever figured out what we did wrong? Rebecca asked, not taking her eyes off the docking procedures below. Veltar's features glowed with what Rebecca had learned was a Kethmori equivalent of amusement. Over the years, their friendship had deepened beyond simple cooperation. They understood each other in ways that transcended species barriers. We showed them that being advanced isn't about the power to keep others out, Veltar replied, his harmonic voice creating those complex overtones that still gave Rebecca chills. It's about the wisdom to let them in. Through the viewport, the station's central gardens were visible, a massive green space where artificial gravity and careful climate control had created a park that could have existed on any habitable world. Human children played alongside Kethmori younglings, their laughter mixing with the musical communication of a dozen different species. Zektari adolescents, who looked like walking trees, played a game that resembled basketball with Kilnari children whose butterfly wings created rainbow patterns in the artificial sunlight. The sound shouldn't have harmonized. Human laughter, Kethmori singing, Zektari drumming, Kilnari chiming. By all the rules of acoustics and biology, it should have been chaos. Instead, it created a symphony that spoke a home in every language simultaneously. The galaxy's rejects had found something more valuable than sanctuary. They'd found a place where being different wasn't liability. It was a strength. Where being homeless didn't make you worthless. It made you family. The Galactic Council still existed, still maintained their rigid hierarchies and exclusive memberships. But their influence was shrinking every year as more species chose the Earth model over the Council system. Cooperation instead of competition. Inclusion instead of exclusion. Help instead of exploitation. Earth hadn't just saved the Kethmori. It had accidentally started a revolution that was spreading across the galaxy, one refugee ship at a time. And humanity, the species that had once been too primitive to matter, was now teaching the universe what civilization really meant.